So let me begin by this quotation from James Woodward about memory and how memory is related to personality, personhood, who we are. The thing I most fear, almost, is the loss of my memory for what are we without our memory? Our whole character, the personality we built up over the years is made out of memories. To have no memories is to become a ghost. I think that's really an interesting perspective. How does our memory, what we hold about ourselves, when that disappears, does our personality disappear with it? Which causes us, I think, to probe what we understand by personality and how much it's dependent on our experience, and what our experience tells us about ourselves. And when we lose that knowledge, that store of our experience, who are we? Are we just someone who's reacting to the present? And on what basis do we do that? My research, many years ago now, a frighteningly long time ago, was getting people to assess their own memory. When they were, I'm ashamed to say, my youngest was 50. I tested people from the age of 50 to late 80s, and 50 was my starting point for aging, which is scary. When I was 21 at the time, but memory's really interesting in the way that we're conscious of it. And we all complain, we all get rather frustrated when we forget things, so it's something that we get anxious about, and particularly now, this is 30 odd years on from when I did my PhD, the anxiety around memory has increased dramatically. And if you ask people what they're most frightened of in their lives, it's no longer getting cancer, but it's dementia. And maybe that first quotation is actually, resonating with that. So the older people become more and more anxious about it. We're not very good at assessing our memories. So one of the findings of my research was that actual performance against self-assessed performance did not match up. And what was the best predictor of performance was something like IQ, which is not surprising. But the more, this is a comfort to you all, the more demanding your lives are, the more likely you are to notice slips of memory. And therefore, the more anxious you might become about it. But actually, compared with others, your memory is most likely to be a lot better than you think. And of course,
So did you look into how good people are at telling how their relative performance, so not relative to other people, whether their own memory is deteriorating or not? No.
Part of the question, in the questionnaire, they were asked to do that. But what I did was I gave them memory tests, and then I got them to assess, and they did a self-evaluation of memory. And when I compared as well the discrepancy between actual and self-assessment, it was interesting that those who scored highly on the actual performance, on their self-assessment, they rated themselves a lot lower than those who performed poorly on the assessment. So it's really interesting. We are not very good at evaluating our memories. And yet, What's really, I think, disconcerting as people get older is their anxiety about this increases. So it becomes a major source of stress because of the fear of dementia. Yeah? And of course, comparing your current memory with your early memory requires memory, doesn't it? So it's all a bit of a knot, really. There's all kinds of different types of memory. I mean, are you familiar with the psychology of memory? I don't really want to, it's not, I mean, some people like me think it's very exciting and interesting, but it can be really, if you're not interested in cognitive science, it can be a bit boring, really. But essentially, we have different kinds of memories. And I think what a lot of people think their memory slips are about in old age is they actually is not quite right in terms of our understanding of memory. It's incorrect. We have short-term memory, which is over just a few seconds. Working memory is the really interesting thing with ageing, and this is where we hold things in mind to process them, yeah, and do things with, which is slightly different from short-term memory. Yeah, you know, I might ask you to remember to prompt me and remind me that I mustn't forget about buying some milk. I don't have to, I'm not doing anything with that fact. Whereas in working memory, we might be doing some kind of calculation. We might be able to work something out in relation to that fact. And then you've got long-term memory, which is, as it says, really, okay. But then there's other kinds of memory, sort of subsets, where we've got memories, which is semantic, about the memory that underpins us making sense of the world. We've got episodic memory, which are these specific events. And then the autobiographical memory. And it's interesting, isn't it? What do elderly people talk about most of the time? It's autobiographical memory. They tell you the stories about their lives. And they might be telling us complete fiction. That's the other thing about the research in this area. We can't validate it. You know, most of the time. Sometimes we can ask other relatives and people who've been present at the events whether they're correct or not. But it could be complete fiction. I pose the question, does that matter? What purpose does it serve for that person? What is going on when we, if you like, retell the story of our lives? And what significance does that hold for the person, psychologically and spiritually? And I wonder whether that's what we should be thinking about, rather than whether the content is actually true. Now, clearly, if it's all complete fantasy, we're into, a mental health issue. But I'm talking about ordinary folk, yeah, who might misremember the month when something happened, or the year, or who was present, yeah. Or muddle up the facts a little bit, or gloss over things, or see it through rose-tinted spectacles, as we say. But what's the significance of this for them? I think it's a really important question. Working memory is the thing that actually begins to decline most rapidly. So this is actually Liz Mailer, who was doing her PhD the same time as me and ended up at Warwick. She did a lot of work subsequently with the professor I worked with. And you can see what the declines are there. And one of the things I think that's really helpful for us just to clock in terms of church life are things like interference from irrelevant information, concentration capacity, and we're not good at free recall without prompts and recognition. Yeah? So there's some decline and individual differences. Age is not a good predictor of this, full stop. That's really, really important. It is IQ. that awful word, but it's true. We slow down in our speed of processing. We suffer from different demands on attention, and we divide our attention, and we're not good at retrieving things without prompts and cues. Okay. Now, what about narrative and our life story? Well, memories are the built. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question about
sure.
the psychology? Is it? I think I understand when we retrieve certain memories, maybe it's just long-term memory, we often change them in the process.
Yes.
Or is that okay?
Yeah, we can do, and I think memories, I mean, I'll come on to this a bit later on, but the really important thing about our memories is they're not static. You know, we don't store something and then just retrieve it as it is. And it's because we're constantly processing our memories, okay? So we reinterpret something, an event, in the light of new knowledge, and then we store that reinterpretation. So I think that's a really important point about memory that a lot of people don't get. They think it's in the memory and it stays as it is in the memory. But we are constantly reappraising. So you know, I might recall a meeting, talk to someone about it. That's how I remember it. They might give me a completely different view on that meeting. And so then my memory of it incorporates that, yeah? Or is challenged by that, yeah? So what we store as well is not distinct episodes, yeah? We are storing the story, okay? So, and I think that's really important because we retain stories, yeah? And so, and the stories are part of the meaning making that we attach to these experiences. We make sense of these experiences, these, if you like, what happens to us through narrative. And the narrative is part of the memory, okay? And what I think is really interesting to ask ourselves is how the various episodes or events in our lives are shaped by our personality. How does our personality shape the narrative that we store with the memory? And how does that influence who we are and how we see ourselves? Okay, so those things are all tightly integrated. And how do we stand back from all of this to glean wisdom? It's very subjective, all of this. Memories are hugely subjective. And I think sometimes we just think that, you know, we just, if you like, store things as they are, but we don't. So stories are integrated into memories. They're narrativized summaries of events. And we have various templates that we use to interpret experiences and construct the narrative. So, I think dear old John Bowlby's internal working models is really relevant to the study of memories and narrative. Yeah, and how it shapes us. Yeah. So they're a blend of fact and, dare I say it, fiction, which I think becomes really interesting. And I pose the question again, what significance does that have? How much does that matter? Yeah. As we progress through our lives then, and we gain more experience, we're exposed to different interpretations. How does that change what we remember and how we view ourselves? Okay? How do our motives and our goals shape what we remember? I think it's a really interesting question. Do I interpret an episode in my narrative as a success or a failure? Do I interpret it as something that was significant because it really mattered to me, or was it something that really mattered to me once but doesn't matter to me anymore, so therefore I've changed what I attribute to that and how I work with it? Okay? And I think this is part of this ongoing shaping and changing of memory. But what we hope for changes the way we interpret what's happened to us and the significance we attach to that. Okay? So what we hope for, what our goal is, may or may not influence the significance of an event in the past. How did I come to be in this place? Was the fact that I failed that exam, the important thing, or maybe failing that exam took me on a different route, and that was the important thing for me to get to where I want to go to. And so all the time we're evaluating these experiences and weaving them into our narrative. Okay? So the future hope also affects what we store in the, if you like, the interpretation and the narrative that we store, which keeps changing. So what happens in later life when that hope or the goal of the future might be, I haven't got much time. The next step is eternity. I tell you, my mother-in-law had just recently gone into residential care, and there was this poignant moment, she's 85, when she said to my husband, well, it's from here to eternity. That is very significant now in the way that she interprets what's happened to her in her life and how she interprets what's happening now and what's that adding to her story. Yeah? I think that's really, really significant. So it doesn't give us pure, unchanging access to what has happened by any means, but it does serve as a sense of self. Yeah? Which it's really interesting because it gives us a sense of continuity of self, but also a changing and evolving self. Most people refer to, when they're thinking about memory, are actually thinking about, in one sense, autobiographical memory. Because it's about telling what's happened to them. Yeah? And yet we use, we don't think of it in that way, but it actually is, When you're having a chat with someone, what are you telling them about? Things that have happened to you in your life. And what's significant about it? Just say, my husband's been difficult. That's a major life event. That's what's happening. Yeah? Also has implications for the future. Yeah? But it's a significant point in the narrative. But we even what happened yesterday. Oh, I met so-and-so. Oh, that was fun. Oh, we went there. Yeah, but it is autobiographical memory. And the thing about sharing narrative and telling stories is it obviously it has significance psychologically. I mean, in psychiatry, what do you do? Listen to narratives. Yeah. What happens in spiritual direction? What happens in counselling? What are we doing in pastoral care? But listening to these stories. And as I say, you know, whether the facts are completely right or not isn't really what we are engaging with. It's what this person is sharing about their interpretation of what has happened to them as they've constructed the story of their life. So hermeneutics become really important. What shapes the interpretation of the narrative? And how does the ageing process play into that? Yeah. What sense do people make of their lives? How do they evaluate and make sense of what's happened to them? And this is where the existential questions come in, the questions of faith. And this becomes more and more important in later life for our well-being. Has my life been worthwhile? Does my narrative tell that I've lived a good life? Living a good life is really important for well-being. Yeah, the evaluation. We all want and need to be seen as being good people, actually. No matter if you've been a crook most of your life, dare I say it, but actually, when it comes to this stage in life, you don't want to be remembered for that. You want to be remembered for having contributed something good. There was something worthy within you. And that's, you know, there's a lot of research that says this is actually a need that we have, to be seen as a good person. Now, it might be that you're seen as a good person in a community of crooks. That is a possibility. But you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah? That sense, because it's something about self-worth and value. Freeman, do people know the work of Freeman in this area? He's really interesting on this. He says that what we're doing then, when we're engaging in this reflection on life, and particularly autobiographical method, is creating a new relationship between the past and present. I love this, a new poetic configuration, which is actually all the time we're rewriting the text of the self. Yeah. I think it's a really helpful way to think about what is going on. Yeah. And then say what is shaping that text. Yeah. And in pastoral ministry, I think that's key. Looking and probing rather for the things that are reshaping this text that's being rewritten. Yeah. So, what goes on in this process? This is all about life review. People know the work of Butler. Butler's he started life review in about 1963, and it's been picked up in gerontology and run with quite. And the components of it are: where have I been, or where have we been? Where are we now? Which is probably about how we got there too. Where are we going? What we hope for? But also there's an evaluative process in that too. What was I good at? Where did I fail? Where did I let myself down, let others? And also looking for patterns. I think that's really interesting. There's something, I think, here, you know, that's about meaning making in part, but looking often with patterns between different members of the family as well, or generational patterns, yeah, which is part of the continuity, I think, that people are striving for, and connection and belonging. The other thing that Butler draws attention to is this articulation of restlessness. Yeah? I think that's partly to do with what I feel uneasy about in the life story, what I'm disturbed about, and what am I seeking, or how am I trying to put this story right so it will conclude well. Yeah? What do I need to address? Yeah? What can I do to rewrite this story well? So I think there's a considerable evaluative process that's going on, process of evaluation at this stage in life, which ties in with Erickson's idea of despair, integrity or despair. Yeah. So, just to summarise, memories are blends of fact and fiction. We refigure new experiences and we re-examine experiences over time. And later life gives us that space to really work with this, generally. How does wisdom and self-understanding work in this? How honest are we, about ourselves in this process? And I think quite often there's quite a lot of glossing, and that goes on at this stage. We exaggerate experiences that comfort us. Yeah. So Butler, 1963, and so we've got a clear focus on this evaluation and a search for meaning taking place. And as part of this process is, how significant am I or have I been? That is really a sharp question in later years. Who do I matter to? Yeah? What purpose does my life hold? Really sharp if you are in residential care, I think. When you are just being looked after, what contribution do you make? How significant am I? And therefore, the significance that you can see of your life in what has been becomes more and more important. Yeah? So, the story that you tell at that stage of life in terms of the identity that you want to maybe preserve and hold on to becomes very, very significant. And where do those, if you like, where does identity become rooted? It's interesting because we have a reminiscent bump. And some of you are far too young in here, I can't do this. But most of the events that form our reminiscent bumps in older age are what happened to us in the age of 18 to 30. Now, I wonder whether that is shifting. With the demographic shift, and also, when you look at people in their 20s and 30s, they are not making those significant life decisions of, partners, family necessarily, at the same time. I think it probably might go to 40. Does that seem reasonable? Yeah? But these reminiscent bumps, these key events, it's a lovely phrase, isn't it, are the central points of the life story. Yeah, it's like if you drew a timeline. But the interesting thing is, they cluster at that point. And McAdams, and his theory of personality, he talks about how we actually generate or create a myth around these episodes. And it gives them a sense of being connected and unity and purpose. So these events, which we have, obviously, we made decisions about, we fit them into the myth that we want to live by. Yeah. So purpose comes into this too. And they tell us, they're the key events that tell the story of who we are and how we became that person. Yeah. And the decision-making process behind those events reveals what we value at that time, yeah, what we believe, and we can, if you like, uncover these life-abiding themes, yeah. But what we strive to be, it's ultimate concerns, if you know Emmons, yes, his work. And I think these events and how we view those and interpret those reveal these ultimate concerns. Now, Foreman has just done some really interesting work on hindsight. And you think, well, isn't that what we're talking about? Really? It's another word for it. And he says, has drawn attention to, one of the functions of hindsight is it shapes and deepens moral life. Now, I got really excited about reading this. I wonder what that might mean for spirituality in older life. I'm going to read you, I hope you'll bear with me, what Foreman talks about in terms of hindsight and the significance for moral life, because he uses an example from Prima Levi's an experience that Prima Levi had in Auschwitz, and it becomes really, really interesting because he says, in August of 1944, Auschwitz was hot and prisoners of the camp were there where there was no drinkable water, and they were tormented by thirst. And during the course of an assignment, which involved clearing out rubble from a cellar, Levi stumbled upon a 2-inch pipe which contained a spigot above the floor. It looked like it might contain water, so he stretched out on the floor and had a few drops. How much? He had asked. Can a 2-inch pipe, 1 or 2 meters high, contain? A litre, perhaps not even that. I could have drunk it all immediately, or save a bit for the next day, or share half of it with Alberto. His friend was with him in the cellar. Or reveal the secret to the whole squad. He chose the third option, that of selfishness extended to the person closest to you. We drank all the water in small gulps, changing places under the spigot, and just the two of us on the sly. Not too long after, as we marched back to the camp, Levi came upon a man called Daniel, all grey with cement dust, his lips cracked and his eyes feverish. There was guilt. I exchanged a look with Alberto. We understood each other immediately and hoped nobody had seen us. But Danielle had caught a glimpse of us in that strange position, supine near the wall among the rubble, had suspected something, and then had guessed. Why? Danielle had asked months later. Why them and not him? Levi has his own question to wrestle with in the aftermath of that event. Is this belated shame justified or not? I was not able to decide then, and I'm not able to decide even now, but shame there was and is. Concrete, heavy, perennial. Danielle is dead now, but in our meetings as survivors, fraternal, affectionate, the veil of that act of omission, that unshared glass of water, stood between us, transparent, not expressed, but perceptible and costly. The question Levi's raising here is a critical one to consider, especially when addressing those aspects of hindsight that bear upon the moral realm. One may condemn oneself after the fact for lacking knowledge that one could not possibly have had. One may also condemn oneself for behaviours that could not have been avoided. In situations like these, a measure of self-charity is called for. Some will be able to move in this direction, others not. And it just occurred to me that quite often stage in life, people reflect on their lives with hindsight. And because of where they are now, they deeply regret what they did in the past. How do they deal with that? What do you do with the narrative when you get that realization? How do you change the narrative? How do you live with it? Yeah? It's absolutely crushing for P11. Absolutely crushing. And how we can feel ashamed with hindsight, through hindsight. What about our identity? Yeah, at that point. How do we see ourselves? And I think these are deep spiritual questions because they take us into self-forgiveness. Yeah. Years later, maybe, you know, it's a similar situation might be what happens when you open a drawer when you're clearing out a house and you discover a bundle of letters that reveal that the person that has just died is not the person that you thought they were. And they were, you know, very close to you and significant. Well, if it's your grandson, you know. What impact does that have on the narrative, on how you see yourselves? And what are the spiritual consequences of that? And I think this is a really sharp question, an interesting psychological question, but also a spiritual question. Especially when you're talking about something that happened many, many years ago. And your understanding and your evaluation maybe of yourself or of others changes. And this is what Foreman is wrestling with. You know, now it can be a positive interpretation. And we tend, don't we, to think perhaps of it in more in those terms, but I think many people are really wrestling with this. It's a torment, yeah, at that stage. So what does it take to forgive oneself for one's sins that have been revealed in hindsight? What does it take to free oneself from the dead weight of the past? And hindsight, I think, and life review can be perilous as well as comforting. And, you know, you look at a lot of the work that's done on this, and, oh, it's a really good thing, life review. You know, those of you who worked in this area will know, isn't it? You know, it's seen as a really positive thing. And I just think, whoa, we need to be aware that it might not always be. And there can be a lot of hard spiritual and psychological work to do. How does that strike you? Can I just ask you about that? Does that... It's a bit depressing. But how does that...
I suppose from a theological perspective, I'm interested that you talk about people forgiving themselves. And yep. I mean, as opposed to being forgiven, for example, by God.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it, in the work on forgiveness, that actually self-forgiveness can be a very painful and difficult part of the process. And I mean, there's several things, isn't there? Self-forgiveness, but also receiving forgiveness from others can be equally tricky for some people. Yeah. Which can be further receiving God's forgiveness for many people is actually to believe that and to live it can be deeply problematic for people. Yeah.
But do you think a Christian understanding of forgiveness is God's forgiveness is prior to self-forgiveness?
Well, we've got to put repentance in here somewhere, have we?
Yeah.
So where does that come in?
Well, prior to God's forgiveness, prior to self-forgiveness.
Yeah. I wonder whether this is about that restlessness too for people with their narrative. And the restlessness is they have not peace about it, which I think self-forgiveness is part of being, finding peace with yourself. Yeah. And that's the thing, you see. This is what hindsight is revealing. The past is not static. It's no longer as, for Primo Levi, it's no longer as it seemed to be. So our understanding keeps on being revised, and sometimes that revised understanding is painful. Yeah? So how does the faith narrative, if you like, become integrated into that as well? What part does that play in the way that we interpret and construct our narrative? Yeah. And especially in later years, I think it takes on a deeper significance because of the closest to death. Yeah. So, just looking at it entirely from the perspective of old age, as we get older, though, we have, life experience does teach us things, and we learn, if you like, and discover meanings and meaning-making strategy, if you like, or meaning-making framework, which enables us to cope, basically. We have time to do this work, yeah, and invest in it. And I think just that very fact, really, all of these things are related to having space to do this work, this spiritual and psychological work. But it can equally be, so this is what I want you to get, it can equally be a time of torment too. Yeah, and a deeply unhappy time. But sharing the story is really important. And the story can facilitate the meaning making and reframing. Yeah. By telling the story, we find a new story. Isn't this what we're doing in pastoral care? Isn't this what we're... I would like to say psychiatry was that really, but it's part of it. Absolutely, it is part of it. And then, how does, the story of God, if you like, facilitate and enrich the story? And ultimately lead to peace. So, what's the wisdom of old age then? Knowing oneself at the end? Possibly, maybe not. Listening to what our stories tell us. Yeah? What does reading the text of our story throw back to us and challenge us? Yeah. Working with alternative interpretations. Yeah? Being open to alternative interpretations. And recognising the positive and the negative things of hindsight. I don't know what the answer is to living by with previous assumptions and the impact of hindsight, actually. I think that's I'm looking at my psychiatrist and saying, what do you do when you just, you look back and you feel that morally you have committed something that you were perhaps in ignorance of, or interpret something in a different way in the past. And how do you, do you unpick it? Do you rewrite it? I think that's a really sharp question.
You can't change the past, can you?
Yeah.
I mean, you can reinterpret it,
Yeah,
as you've been
exactly.
saying, but you can't fundamentally change.
Yeah. And that's the thing about forgiveness, isn't it? In the end of the day, something has happened. A wrong has been done. That can't be undone. Yeah? And all these, you have done something. You might regret it, but it has been done. Yeah.
And I think sometimes one of the problems is it's often easier to hang on to the memory, to the interpretation that you've become familiar with, rather than to let go and not know where you're going to end up.
Yes.
So even an uncomfortable memory interpretation can be seen as preferable to actually letting go and not knowing what's going to happen then. Might things become better, might things get worse. So there's that to overcome, I think, as well.
And I guess, who am I then? If I let go of this, do I know who I am?
Yeah, quite.
As well.
Particularly if it's become part of a strong narrative about who you are. Yeah.
So that's very threatening and risky, isn't it? Yeah.
It's also about what you include in the story, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you might focus on, I don't know, the day you let so-and-so down.
Yeah.
And actually minimise or even forget the many times in which you did good things for them. So that the story becomes one of sin and repentance, when in fact it might have been, with the same facts actually transpired, it might have been one of love and compassion.
Yes, and I mean, McAdams has this idea of scripts, that you can live a redemptive script or a contamination script, as he describes it. And I think that's really perceptive, because that's the that's the way you interpret things, isn't it? So how do you change the script? Yeah. And changing the script, it's a bit like cognitive therapy, isn't it, really? Well, it is, isn't it? Yeah. You're looking for evidence that contradicts the script that you're looking at. Yeah. So maybe that's what this all boils down to, really. Or maybe perhaps not quite. But, Okay. That's just really summarising some of the things I was saying. I wanted to just draw your attention to some interesting work by Carstensen and Charles about some of the changes that take place in older age, and what the implications of those might be for care and spirituality. Let me move to this one. What becomes really interesting is that the goals that older people have become emotional. It's not about what they're going to achieve anymore. It's about how they're going to feel. And when you think about what we're saying about narrative and interpretation, I suggest that might be an influence. I've not really noticed this with my elderly relatives, but on the whole, older people become better at regulating their emotions. And I wonder whether that's tied to the emotional goals. Yeah? They seek out those who are going to, if you like, who they enjoy being with. They're far more selective about the company they seek. Yeah? That's assuming they have choice in this matter, of course. They pay more attention. Here it is. This is very feeling orientated. That they, how they feel now. Yeah, yeah. What's going on for them in the present. Clearly, yes. fragility and value of human life. I really appreciate that. Family and friends, those long-term relationships which they've invested in, the people that know them best, assume much greater importance. Yeah. And I think that's probably, evidence bears that out in my experience. That's what's going on. So, who are the significant others in the narrative? Yeah? And sometimes this can, if you like, be the spur for forgiveness and reconciliation. Yeah? Very close relationships are the really important thing. Of course, they don't have contact with as many acquaintances, and friends die, whatever. But there's a growing desire for meaningful relationships and sustaining relationships. And Klaus looked at self-forgiveness in relation to being supported by church congregations in elderly folk. He said that those who have close, good relationships with members of a faith community were more likely to be able to forgive themselves. And that the quality of those social relationships and the supportive nature of them, not the quantity, the quality, aided self-forgiveness in a community of faith. So I think that's really interesting, because here we've got what's self-forgiveness about is that gap between, what we aspire to be and what we didn't achieve. We let ourselves down. Yeah, we haven't been who we wanted to be. But being supportive, good, positive emotional relationships facilitates this process of self-forgiveness. I hadn't quite expected that. I think I can see how it works, but I hadn't quite expected it. So, well, I finished 5 minutes ago. So memory's the raw material. It's what we work with all the time. Yeah, and it's a mixture of fact and fiction. It's our search for identity and meaning. It's the source of that, I think. As the story changes, as our understanding and interpretation changes, there's an emotional change with it. Close relationships are really significant in our interpretation of our story, our identity. Yeah? And how we reevaluate the story and rewrite the story too, I think. There's a lot of work on wisdom and maturity in the ageing literature. I'm not really sure biblically, yes, it's all there, but is that about the value of hindsight? I wonder. Yeah? And how do we weave the story of God into our personal story? Sometimes that's positive, sometimes it isn't. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.